Good to know.
Okay, good to know. Thank you, Scott. Hi, everybody. I'm at the offices, Seeking Integrity offices in Los Angeles this week. So the background is a little different, but actually, Scott and I are both. We're both in different places
I
tonight.
am in my sister's basement in Muncie, Indiana. Woohoo!
It's exciting. Okay, um, so tonight we've talked about this topic once a couple of years ago, I think, and I wanted to talk about it because I'm with our clients this week, and which is a wonderful treat, by the way, after a year and a half of no travel. So it's been a wonderful thing to be able to move around a little bit. But I'm in working with them this week. It's been interesting because I'm much more aware of um, the struggles with the idea of uncertainty. You know, people are in treatment, they don't know if they have a marriage to go home to, they don't know if the resolution with their spouses will be something that they can live with or not. Uh, there's uncertainty about job situations sometimes, or professional obligations. There's just addiction causes so much wreckage that there's a lot of uncertainty. And I can say the same thing from the partners. You know, is this treatment going to make a difference? Is it going to really work? You know, this time, are there's my husband or wife going to make the changes they need in recovery to help me, you know, move forward? And so I think uncertainty is kind of a fact of life, right? Especially notably in these times of crises in early recovery, but just in general. You know, I was reminded of a medical test where it took like a week to get back in my own life, and just during that time is a really important bit of information to know, but it just I didn't know the answer, you know, for a period of time. You have to sit and wait, and that uncertainty is such a difficult thing to manage. And unfortunately, early recovery particularly is kind of washed over with a lot of uncertainty. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens when we are facing uncertainty, and then how to deal with it. So to drop into the brain, and you folks know I like to kind of delve into that sometimes. You know, we are hardwired as humans to respond to fear. It's an adaptive mechanism that has allowed us to be kind of alert to danger, kind of hypervigilant to potential risk and danger, and to kind of, if given a bunch of stuff on the horizon, our eyes and our brains will focus in on things that could be a possible threat. And so we're kind of hardwired in this way. And unfortunately, when we are experiencing uncertainty, it triggers fear. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But when we don't know all the details, we basically revert to fear, which should, you would think, make us careful. But then what we find is that with fear and a fear response, people get more impulsive. And so instead of being more careful with fear and uncertainty, people start to just like go all in on some decision that may or may not be based on very objective criteria. And so it's just interesting, I think, to apply. So there's a really cool study, and I think last time I brought this up a long time ago, Scott, I didn't have the guy's name. I've researched it since. It's a neuroeconomist, which is an interesting idea, named Colin Kammer. He's a Caltech. And he basically imaged people's brains as they were forced to play a game and forced to make increasingly uncertain bets. And the game was something called Ellsberg paradox, but basically he did two rounds of that. The first, there were 20 cards, and they had to pick whether the card that they picked off the top of the deck would be black or red. And they were told initially there were 10 of each, or 8 of one, 12 of the others. They had some information. And so they were placing kind of very careful bets in terms of what the next card would be, because they had data, they had information to work with to place an educated guess. And then the second part of it, he just said he didn't tell them how many of each color there was. It was like random, and it could be one of 20, whatever that he would pull off. And he actually scanned and imaged their brains while they were in the middle of this kind of state of uncertainty and fear. And what he found was that the part of the brain that was triggered in that situation, where they didn't know how many of red, how many of black, was a very different part of the brain than when they were making calculated risks. So this presence of uncertainty went right to their amygdala. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that's very focused on fear, fear-based threat. It's integrally tied up with addiction and trauma. And so it kind of, this whole other part of the brain was activated. And what he found is that when people were based, subject to fear and experiencing fear, they made kind of impulsive decisions. So very, very long-winded way of pointing out that in addiction recovery, when we're experiencing this uncertainty, when we have this element of not quite knowing what's going to happen, our natural instinctive circuitry for fear is activated, and we start to feel a lot of anxiety. And when we're feeling anxiety, we don't make the best decisions. And so I think all that is a way of saying that uncertainty, especially in recovery, is something that's present. It's always going to be present, but there are ways we can deal with it. I think we have to be conscious about those instead of just reacting out of fear, because chances are if we do that, we're going to make a bad decision. So I want to talk about what happens when we don't have much information to go on. These situations I mentioned at the beginning of uncertainty. Is my husband going to really get it this time? You know, is he going to get in recovery? Or am I going to lose my job? Or am I going to lose my wife or my house? Or, you know, all these things that kind of take time to unfold in recovery. So what can we do? I mentioned that in this uncertainty situation, it goes right to the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system of the brain, which is this whole reward circuitry that's all involved in trauma and emotions and addiction. That's all kind of centralized in this part of the brain. So what we have to do is try to quiet that fear response. So one thing we recommend is spotting fear when it starts. So kind of really being not hypervigilant, but just being alert. And I think mindfulness skills, you know, just noticing, being present, being aware, they're just such a beautiful set of skills for anybody affected by addiction, whether you're a partner or the addict, because this kind of fear-based response is a natural part of our lives sometimes. And being able to like really see it early before it gets a chance to kind of surprise us and grow is important. And then when we start to manage it, or if we observe something we're afraid of, really start to pick apart the irrational thoughts that may go with it. So we have to label those what a therapist would call cognitive errors, are thinking errors, that the ways we think about something to make sense of some data point. So if I see something that's threatening out there, one of the things that's very common is to catastrophize. Like, oh my God, this is horrible. This is not going to end well. This is going to be a catastrophe. This is devastating. And it may be just a little blip on a warning sign, but we kind of take it and rush with it and run all the way to the bottom of the fear. Instead of that irrational thought, irrational thoughts, focus on the rational thoughts. Do some self-talk to correct your affirmation. Kind of talk yourself off the ledge, basically, so that you can kind of not be reacting in a fear place, but kind of quieting that limbic system, that fear response. And then really manage the emotions that are triggered. So if I have anxiety that comes up, maybe there's ways and tools I can apply to calm that anxiety down. Maybe some of the techniques we talk about in this webinar a lot, you know, the breathing techniques, 4-7-8 breathing, or the 5-4-3-2-1 way to reduce using senses to reduce anxiety, or doing mindfulness, or practicing going to a safe place. There's lots of grounding tools, but all those are really effective at managing those emotions. So that's the first thing, quieting the limbic system, just really calming down that instinctive response of our brain. The second one, and this is maybe harder than that, is to kind of stay positive. And I think this is really hard. You know, many times we have a choice of whether to kind of frame something in more optimistic terms or negative terms. And I don't mean to be kind of ridiculously Pollyanna-ish about it, but to really not let the negativity overtake us and be more balanced. But I think also that sometimes, at least for me, includes focusing on positive stuff. Like what are the advantages of this? What might be a good outcome from this? And part of that, for me, by the way, is gratitude. And we've talked about gratitude a lot on this webinar as well, but the importance of gratitude and sort of keeping us grateful, knowing that we can manage with whatever might come. The third thing is to really stay balanced. And that, again, kind of is affected by those cognitive errors I mentioned. So the catastrophizing, the black and white thinking, you know, it's either this or that. You know, he's either going to make it or it's doomsday. And maybe there's some other choices in between. Maybe there's other options, shades of gray, if you will. Jumping to conclusions, all these cognitive errors, rationalizing, denying, all those tools that we kind of employ, a lot of addicts employ very well to kind of stay locked up in the addictive system. So I think we really need to focus on what matters in those situations, you know, right, reprioritize, not get caught up on some irrelevant detail, but really focus on what matters and take care of ourselves. The fourth thing with this uncertainty is to really kind of not to seek perfection in terms of how we respond and what we do, but just to kind of really go forward and manage with the tools that we have. And I think most people do far better than they think they're going to or are capable of in managing situations. All it takes really is consciousness to really be aware of what's going on, being aware of your thoughts, being aware of your body, and just kind of starting to have that awareness and then apply the tools that we practice as part of that. Also, when we're facing uncertainty, one of the worst mistakes people can make, I think, is start to second guess ourselves. Okay, well, that's what I thought an hour ago, but now I've been worrying about this and I'm thinking it may be something else. So maybe my decision to do what I already decided to do an hour ago won't work and I need to try something else. And we can start to live with this uncertainty and anxiety. I think it's just really calm ourselves down, decide a course of action and follow through with it, not to second guess ourselves. And by the way, the worst form of second guessing is the what if. I mean, we can torture ourselves with what if. Well, what if X happens? What if Y happens? What if Z happens? What then? And that's just such a classic hallmark of anxiety, where we can take information, just kind of run with it and scare ourselves to death, really, because 99% of that stuff, if not 99.9% of that stuff, is never going to happen. It's just our minds run with it and create this a firestorm of anxiety. And so asking yourself what if is definitely not the way to go. And then finally, and this is a hard one, is really kind of trust our gut. I think we have some intuition. We're kind of wired for it in ways that we're discovering more and more in terms of our guts, but really try to filter out all the external factors that may be kind of spinning us into a negative mode or some confusing images, but really try to get quiet, trust our gut, see what really is important, manage what's important, figure out where our needs are, what's most important, and really go with the feeling. So those are some tools. In the end, we can't control the uncertainty, but all we have really control over is our reaction to it. I think it's really important to try to practice those, to manage those situations as best we can. And I think with that, I'll be quiet. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, David. Type your questions about, we're talking about uncertainty tonight for those of you who got here late. So if you have questions about that or any other, anything else to do with addiction, recovery, relationships, healing, type your questions into the Q&A feature and we will get to them. David, can we spin this into, we can take uncertainty and spin it into an addicted relationship where, let's say the husband is the addict and the wife is the betrayed. Let's call it sex addiction. So let's call the wife the betrayed partner. I find it interesting that both partners are really living in uncertainty. And we were talking about this in my level 3 group yesterday. We were talking about codependence versus prodependence. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds with that. But, the partner, if we've got a wife here, is surrounded by codependency people. They're telling her there's something wrong with her because of her childhood, and that's why she partnered with this defective person. And so, but they're telling her there's something wrong with her, which prodependence does not, which is why we take the prodependence approach with seeking integrity. Meanwhile, the addict is saying, often because the wife is getting those messages, is thinking, well, if she's that defective, why is she with me? I mean, what does that say about me? How defective am I? How awful am I that I attract broken people? And it's kind of a bad system, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how can I get well? How can we get well? If we're all this damaged, and I like what you said about staying positive with reframing, because prodependence reframes codependency. She's not damaged for picking you. She's wanting to stay attached to someone she cares about. And the addict, it's, if the addict is not looking at her as damaged, he can say, well, maybe there's enough good in me that I'm worth saving. If that wonderful person is sticking with me, maybe I'm worth it. And maybe I do deserve to recover. But there's still that uncertainty about, what's going to happen, which was, I got off in the weeds. I didn't mean to, but how can the addict deal with the uncertainty of, can I recover? Do I deserve to recover? And how can the betrayed partner deal with the uncertainty of, will he recover? Will our relationship recover? You know, what will become of me? You know, what will happen to me? I mean, all of it. I mean, you brought it up because this is obviously happening in the house right now in our treatment center.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. And I think you're so right, Scott, in that when we have a crisis in our lives, and that's certainly what you just described, that situation as a crisis, it activates all the other crises we've ever had in our lives, right? And including the self-doubts, the second guessing, the relationships. And so we have a lot of history that starts to play a role in this and inform what's going on. And that kind of worsens it, because this may not be the first attempt at recovery, or there may have been a previous relationship that had similar kind of patterns or echoes of that. And so I think there's a lot of kind of uncertainty sloshing around in the system that kind of creates these waves and cross currents, and makes it really difficult for people if they stay in their heads. And I think one of the things I talked about, tools to kind of quiet the internal voice here, but I think it's really important too to be patient. And that's a whole other webinar on learning patience. But to know that this is going to unfold, and it's unfortunately going to unfold at sometimes very slow pace, sometimes quickly, but often kind of an agonizing slow, because we just don't know we don't know the end of the story. And that's what people have such a hard time dealing with. So I think applying some basic program skills we have, like one day at a time, is really kind of a simplistic platitude, I guess, but it sure is. It has an incredible amounts of wisdom there, because that's really all we have. We have today. And as much as I'd like to predict the future, I have no power to do that. All I can do is take action today. And whether you're, and partners and addicts are going to be taking different steps, different recovery steps, but they're still on the same path of kind of dealing with their own feelings, trying to stay upbeat, and not not predict the future, and predict the end of the story. And I think that's just, if there's one big thing I think that trips up anybody in recovery or partners, is this idea of like, I just got to know now. And it's our own anxiety. It's our own inner voice that is so uncomfortable with like living with this uncertainty. And because, I mentioned how our brains are kind of wired to go right to the amygdala and the fear response, but uncertainty is a lot of pain. There's a lot of emotional pain that goes with this situation. And so in a way, people are projecting that this kind of pain is going to go on forever. And I think that also drives people toward wanting some kind of quick resolution, but it just doesn't happen that way. And so I think what we have to do is really kind of practice self-care as much as we can in those moments.
Type in some questions. We don't have any yet. Got something in the chat feature. Yeah, spot on. As a betrayed spouse with lots of childhood trauma, my husband's sex addiction rocked my world, despite years of trauma therapy, EMDR, and somatic experiencing. Thanks for the cognitive errors reminder. Thank you both for being here. Yeah, betrayed spouse who comes in with trauma, which is normal. We all have trauma. And it sounds like there was trauma therapy before, but then sex addiction came along and new trauma. How often do we see this, David? And
yeah, thank you for that comment, because what we know increasingly, and the research bears this out, is that addiction, both the addict and oftentimes people in that addictive system, have a history of trauma, and almost universally. And even if people thought they didn't have trauma, they may have experienced emotional neglect, which is something that's not there. So it's harder to see. People say, I've had a great childhood, but when we start really asking questions, not so much. But I think, so my point is that we all bring this trauma with us, and good for you for having, EMDR, somatic experiencing. These are all really wonderful trauma techniques. But my experience with my own trauma is that we can deal with it to a certain level, and then a new situation, a new crisis particularly, will come into my life. And even though I've kind of put that old trauma, I thought, to bed, I think new traumas resonate. They feel like that old stuff. And I think to that extent, it gets activated. I'm not back at square one. I still have a lot of tools. I have a lot of awareness, but those old feelings are activated again. And I think it's not a bad time to maybe revisit some of have a couple sessions of EMDR and process it. But I think those echoes of those old times come to life. And I think that starts to also push us to catastrophize and to put ourselves into a corner with black and white thinking. It's got to be this or it's that, and no other thing in between, or jump to conclusions, all that stuff that we do with cognitive errors. So I think the role of trauma is really critical in this, and understanding us. And if you've had a history of trauma and hopefully have had some treatment for it, there are tools that can kind of help us regulate when we have that, when we're triggered. You know, we, even with the best trauma therapy, if we live our lives outside of a vault, we're going to experience things that challenge us sometimes, including, unfortunately, some trauma, or things that remind us of trauma in our own lives. And so I think really recognizing that and equipping ourselves with the tools to deal with that is really, really important.
By the way, David and I are happy to just meander and go wherever our conversation takes us, but ask questions. This is for you, not us. But David, since while we're waiting on questions, could you explain a little bit about PTSD and how trauma repeats, just kind of in a general way, in case people aren't all that familiar with, trauma from my childhood, maybe before I can even remember, might be affecting me today, etc.
Yeah, so we are learning more and more about trauma. But trauma, as Scott just mentioned, can be verbal memory, cognitive memory, or can happen early, even pre-verbal stuff. And we know that trauma is kind of held within the body's nervous system. It's not just a thought and memory, it's kind of embedded. And if you've had a massage, for example, and we've had a massage and suddenly you find yourself in tears or you find yourself laughing, they've hit a point, and we hold different emotions in different parts of our bodies. And the same is held with trauma and trauma reactions. That's why any good trauma therapy is not just a cognitive, talking kind of therapy, but it involves some recognition that there's a mind-body connection here, and that a lot of the trauma that has to be released has to come from our bodies. And so somatic experiencing, as someone mentioned, breath work, any kind of tapping, all those things recognize that there's a physiological component. EMDR has a body component as well. So I think it's really important. But what that means is that this is kind of embedded within us. And when situations come along that remind us of old trauma, and trauma really are events in our lives that kind of overwhelm our ability to process the memory, right? Instead of getting completely filed away, things get kind of stuck. And so when an event happens that reminds us of something that once happened to us before, a traumatic event, our minds, the amygdala, among others, same thing where uncertainty lives, is triggered, and as if it's happening right now. And the part of the brain with the amygdala, it was only getting sensory inputs. It doesn't really have a time context, meaning that it doesn't know you're 4 years old again and being abused again. The brain thinks, whoa, fire alarms go off. It's getting this like threat signal. And so we can constantly be activated through our lives unless we do some trauma work to process it. But even then, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, we still can get triggered. It's not going to be as serious as a reaction as it might be, but we have to, I think, constantly be alert to that and manage or do some self-regulation should that occur.
Yeah, and when the amygdala is triggered that way, I might call it the lizard brain. It's the oldest part of the brain, and every creature has it. But what the lizard lacks is the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking part of the brain.
Right.
When the amygdala is activated, it shuts down the prefrontal. It just kind of cuts off communication.
Yeah, I was just telling our clients, talking about that today, and that this happens in addiction too. And as addiction sort of takes over that midbrain, the neural connections to the prefrontal cortex, which is like the adult in the room, right? That gets kind of frayed. And so, and by the way, with that goes our impulse control. And so we become increasingly in addiction. we're getting these signals to act out from this part of our brain, and early on, until it kind of is reestablished, the prefrontal cortex, which would normally have the impulse control, the sort of saying, whoa, no, that's not a good idea, that won't end well, let's not do that, that part of the brain is kind of shut off. And so we're almost particularly more vulnerable to it. And by the way, so you see some convergence here of trauma and fear, uncertainty, addiction. It all kind of is rooted and swimming around in the same place in the brain.
So let me ask you one more trauma-related question, then we'll jump to the Q&A. We do have a question, but type some more in there. We're going to need more. Um, you mentioned that a lot of times addicts, when we come to treatment, and this was certainly the case for me, we think, oh, I had, my childhood was wonderful when somebody asks about it, and then you start exploring a little bit and you realize, oh my God, not so wonderful. I was neglected, or I was abused, or, what percentage, and I'm just asking for addicts right now, what percentage of people walk in the door thinking they have no childhood trauma, and then when they take a peek and get realistic, they find out that, oh wow, that was traumatic, and that was traumatic, and that was traumatic, and
yeah, I think we're kind of wired to minimize the awareness of that. I think that's kind of maybe a protective mechanism in our brains. But I think once we do start to see it, for percentage wise, I'm thinking of the assessments I do when people come in, and my own clients over the years. I'd say upwards of 50%, maybe 40% of people come in who are confused when we ask questions about trauma because they don't identify anything, or they have no memory. They have no memory of the childhood, before 8 or 6, which is kind of an indicator also that there's something there that their brain is just kind of clouded over in an effort of self-preservation. But they're disconnected from that until some trauma work. But I think a lot of people, that situation you just gave, and I'll just flesh out a little bit. So somebody might say, well, I had no trauma. And what I look for, by the way, the big thing that is the exception, we can look at sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse or spiritual, intellectual abuse, but it's harder to see something that wasn't there. And we know that there's something, a major factor in causing trauma is neglect. And they always that's confusing because, well, we had a nice house and great food, and I had clothes and great family vacations and a car when I was 16, and I wasn't neglected. I had everything I could have wanted, except what we call parental attunement, parental interest, somebody saying, I love you, somebody giving you a hug, somebody going to your recital, somebody going to your football game, somebody taking an interest when you were crying, somebody being there emotionally for you. And as children, if we have inconsistent, unconditional love from a caregiver, we rapidly and quickly, out of self-preservation, conclude, well, I can't rely on anybody. I'm not safe. I can't depend on you. I'm not going to trust you. I'm not going to be vulnerable and open up to you. And all those core beliefs have direct ramifications on our ability for intimacy, for capacity. If I grow up as an adult, not even remembering those kind of core beliefs early on, but I have real trouble trusting people, and I never am vulnerable. I never open up, and all these things. It's why we call addiction an intimacy, or sex addiction, an intimacy disorder, because we have a lot of trouble relating to people and connecting in a way that really fosters intimacy. And so I think that neglect, based on a lack of emotional support, can be very traumatic and result in trauma. And I just want to plug a beautiful book by a friend of ours named Enid Gray called
I just put it in the chat feature. Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Yeah, she nailed it. And it's just a really important book.
Yeah, Neglect, the Silent Abuser. Fantastic book. Yeah. I started to delve into my own past, but this is not about me today. My husband plays the what if game. What if the car breaks down when we are on a road trip? What if I lose my job? What if we get there too late and there's no place to sit? I used to try and talk him down, but it didn't work. So instead, I repeat the question and expect him to actually come up with answers. Or I take it to the extreme. What if aliens land and we can't get the car fixed? What if the rapture started and the only people left at your job are jerks? Point out that we can come up with all sorts of creative scenarios, but it doesn't mean it will happen. I kind of like that. David?
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the techniques I use with clients sometimes, if they have this kind of negative self-talk, like this, what if, go in their heads, um, as sometimes it's useful to take something to the extreme and say, okay, let's just take this and run with it. And what if aliens do land? And could happen, right? And so we get in. But I think putting a spin on it like that and just seeing kind of how absurd it can be at some point is true. I have my own experience in the past couple of days. Every time I'm in Los Angeles, I worry about parking. I like to go places and meet friends at restaurants and stuff, but parking is like my biggest nightmare. So I worry about parking. And I was projecting all day. I did a dinner date the other day, and all day long I worried about how am I going to park? And it just, okay, I'll deal with it on the spot, or I'll take an Uber, whatever. But I was living what I'm talking about tonight, just like, what if? And it was 12 hours away. So and I didn't know anything about the parking situation where we were going. It might have been a valet or a parking lot, who knows? But my mind took it and ran with it. And I was strictly operating out of fear. And I was reminded how obsessive that can be. We take that stuff and we stick to it and we run with it. And so I think that what if game is just really dangerous. And it's a way of taking all that anxious energy and kind of applying it and spelling it out, but it's not a productive use of our mind or our time, because yeah. And I love your response. Just take it to the absurd level and reflect it back.
Yeah, and I actually like the first part of that. What if the car does break down? What if? I mean,
Yeah.
and force
And
them to answer. Well, I guess we'll call AAA. And
right, exactly. Yeah, we'll figure it out. And by the way, and I'm glad we're talking about trauma. I just want to tie these two things together, because when we experience trauma, and most of us in this webinar probably have, as children, it sets in motion this way of reacting to stuff. And this idea of like, what if the car breaks down? It's like, okay, the presumption of a question like that is that we're still 4 years old and have no power and control over anything. It's really from that from that child mindset of like, I'm powerless there. I have no control. But no, that's not the case anymore. We do have, that's not, I mean, I have to honor that. I guess that if that were my voice, maybe that my wounded 4-year-old who's in there still, I know that. But guess what? He's not alone. He's got me. I'm a grown up. I have means. I have, skills and a phone and a wallet, and I can find a solution. But that's what I mean when we kind of lose connection with some of our rational thinking. It just, we're reacting out of fear and not reason.
yeah, and it's a post-traumatic stress response, or maybe just a maladaptive coping response to a situation that feels stressful. So I'll not do stress by not doing anything. I'll sit in my comfy, easy chair, and I never have to feel stress again.
Right. Right.
And I think that's kind of the failure to launch syndrome. That we see with some of our younger clients who just kind of haven't launched because it's stressful to launch. It's stressful to go to college. It's stressful to get a job.
It's risky. We might get hurt. We might get emotionally hurt. We might,
Which is the same reason addicts turn to addiction. It's risky. You might reject me. I might open up to you, and you might not respond to my needs, and then what?
And what is addiction except a way to divert all that energy and kind of numb or just escape it or not have to deal with it, right? We just push it to the side.
Yeah. So okay. I just wrote the comment about trauma earlier. Can the betrayed spouse with childhood trauma, family history of addictions, including sex addiction and violence, also have her own love/sex addiction? Or am I just getting confused about everything, thinking too much? And should I just focus on the betrayal trauma first? Thank you. Very interesting question.
Yeah, and thank you for that question, because I think once we get involved and really start to take this seriously, whether we're a betrayed spouse or the addict themselves, we start to see patterns. We start to kind of get self-aware, and we start to try to figure out and label what's going on, and try to make sense of things. And I think that's, for me at least, I think that's been a very exciting kind of exploratory phase. I try to do it with feedback, because left to my own devices, I can get all kinds of crazy ideas, but whether the feedback of a therapist or a friend or a sponsor, but I kind of bounce these ideas around. But I think it's a good thing to be exploring these things. And and for me, that means kind of trying it on, looking at something from a different perspective and seeing if it fits or not, if it feels right. And yeah, I mean, betrayed spouses certainly can have their own addictions as well. And that it doesn't preclude that at all. But I think just like if I have an addict come to treatment, um, there's so many emotional upsets and consequences that go with that state, that I think it's a real mistake to, as a clinician, make a diagnosis. Maybe somebody's really acting really crazy, and having all kinds of mood swings. They're laughing one time and crying hysterically the next, and they're kind of expressing a lot of fear, and they look kind of psychotic. And I think, we've had clients who would be diagnosed by somebody who really didn't know addiction as bipolar or schizophrenic or something when they're in the middle of this crisis. And I guess for a partner, I would say, yeah, be careful about jumping to conclusions about what you might be in the middle of that state. I think those kind of awarenesses do take time to kind of unfold, but I think some of the totally understandable reactivity and concern and information seeking and all that drive those things that we do to drive us toward emotional safety can look obsessive. They can look ways that may be reflective of something else. But I think it's really just a reaction. I think most of it is explained by the impact of the addiction on your lives. And then sometimes once the dust settles there, I think it's easier to see, okay, maybe there might be a relationship addiction here, a romance addiction, or some other kind of thing going on. But I would let the immediate reactivity of that initial phase kind of settle down before we jump to conclusions about something else.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the garden path I was on earlier with codependence versus prodependence. Codependence, even though it's never been an official diagnosis, it gets treated like it's a diagnosis, and it feels like a diagnosis when somebody says, "Oh, you're codependent," especially if it's a therapist telling you that, and that feels like the problem is with you. Prodependence recognizes that you might be behaving in ways that look a little nuts right now, but it's because you're in crisis, and
Right.
people in crisis struggle. So you've got to kind of work through the crisis stage of what, particularly with betrayed partners, you've got to get through the crisis before you can get a decent look at what else might be going on, if anything. And as David said, with active addiction, I mean, active addicts look nuts. I mean, we behave horribly. We behave like terrible, crazy people. That doesn't mean we are terrible, crazy people. Doesn't mean we have huge issues. We might just be an addict, but we might also have some other issues. So yeah.
Yeah.
So don't try to label yourself too soon. But
Right.
but I agree with David. Yeah, sure, you could be an addict or not.
And I just want to come back to that question, because I think the question at the end, I would endorse what you said. Should I just focus on the betrayal trauma? To me, that's the big elephant in the room early on. I think, yeah, definitely focus on that, including the skills to help yourself deal with the symptoms of that trauma, and then to start doing the work underneath. And really keeping in mind, trauma, the best trauma therapy includes not just talk therapy, but some other kind of what we call somatic component, some attention to how trauma might be held in the body. If people haven't read or are interested in more of this kind of stuff, I would recommend The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, who's an amazing psychiatrist that talks about, just, and very readable, how this is embedded in our nervous system and how important it is to recognize that.
I'm popping this in the body. I can't type today. Sorry. I wanted to get his name in there because it's spelled weird.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott.
So yeah, and that's the prodependence approach too. Let's deal with the crisis of betrayal. Let's deal with the trauma of betrayal. And then if you want to do some other work and examine your childhood or whatever else is going on, by all means, but let's get through the crisis first. And that just makes a lot more sense.
And I'll just, if I may, when by definition, if somebody comes to treatment, they are in crisis and their wives or husbands are in crisis, right? That's just the way it is. Strictly from a clinical point of view, what do we do with crises? We don't talk about the past. Crisis intervention counseling is present tense. It's like, okay, let's deal with the here and now. Let's deal with the immediate situation. Let's give you ways to regulate and calm down and deal with this. We don't start in the middle of a crisis by digging back into the past, right? It's really present tense oriented. So I think it's really important to keep in mind. It's a way of keeping focused on next steps.
Yeah, and looking at the past is important at the right stage of recovery.
Totally important, but timing is everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me see. Advice for sex addict and partner as sex addict heads out on first overnight business trip since D-Day and sobriety pre-COVID. What kind of safeguards can be built in or mechanisms can be in place to reassure the partner? And also we need some mechanisms in place to help the addict stay sober. I'll just throw that in myself. The addict says he isn't tempted at all, though travel was a major hookup opportunity during addiction. David?
Yeah, it's a great question. And travel and hotels, I think, are really a major trigger for a lot of sex addicts, if not all sex addicts. So I understand your concern. This is a big deal. But I think there are safeguards that can be put in. I think different kinds of accountability checks, whether that's on the part of the addict, calling sponsors, calling friends, arranging a meeting before he gets to wherever he's going, kind of researching what's online or what's available in person, as some meetings are now around the country. Really kind of just doing everything you can to stay engaged in program. One of the big, I think, predictors of success in recovery is kind of routines and structure and having a time and place for things. And when we travel, that's all kind of thrown up in the air. We're not around our safeguards and our systems and our structure. And so I think we have to kind of build those, create those around us when we travel and kind of do as much as we can. I think from the partner's point of view, it's hard because there's never going to be enough, I think, safeguards to totally assure you that it's all okay. But I think brief check-ins, I think just contact, at some point you are powerless over what happens. But I think just staying in close contact and staying with your own support system as well, really kind of processing your feelings with your support system as well. Scott, as a sponsor, what would you say to a sponsee who was going to make a trip like this for the first time?
Well, the first thing I would say to this particular individual, who says he isn't tempted, although travel was a major hookup opportunity, is, you say you're not tempted now, but wait until you're, 600 miles from home in a hotel room and you're bored and you're alone.
That's right, yeah.
You're bored, you're lonely, and your head's going to be, suddenly you're going to be triggered. You better be ready for it. So have your sponsor on speed dial, have scheduled check-ins with your partner. I will call you after dinner, and then I'll call you again before I go to bed. So I'll call you at 10:30 and we can talk for as long as you. That way the partner at least knows I'm alone at 10:30 and in my hotel room with the door locked. But bookend, call your sponsor at night, call your sponsor in the morning, have them on speed dial, make sure your sponsor or some other accountability partner is willing to pick up the phone at 2 a.m. if you're triggered. Things like that, especially on the first trip. I mean, and schedule. Free time. Business trips are like business and free time. Unstructured free time.
Yeah.
It's just unstructured free time is a big trigger. So, build in a meeting online or in person, anything you can do to keep the focus on recovery and keeping your commitments to your partner versus just sitting around with nothing to do. That's the big thing. So, yeah.
And if it's possible, I really like to arrange a face-to-face meeting with someone in recovery. Where you're going, and go to a meeting together, something like that. And sometimes you may know somebody in that city, you may not. Actually, this happened a couple of times with friends of mine because of all the meetings on Zoom. When they've started traveling someplace, they actually know people there, and so meet them for dinner or something. If both functions to fill up some of that free time that Scott was just talking about, and also I think that face-to-face engagement is so important for grounding and for recovery.
Yeah, I agree. And you can always call the central office for the area. If it's a big city, you know, if you're going to Chicago, there's a central office for Sex Addicts Anonymous. You can call them and say, hey, I don't know anybody, but I need an accountability buddy for a day. Can you point me? Can you give me a phone number? Somebody I can call and meet for coffee or whatever, and make a new friend. That's not a sexual friend that I'm going to act out with. So yeah. All kinds of precautions. Yeah. How can I handle my sex addict spouse when his need for approval by other women to make himself feel good bothers me? For instance, to make himself feel like a good husband bothers me. For instance, I had a female coworker of his say to me upon first meeting her while out shopping, say to me in front of my spouse, he is so nice. He tells me that he can't wait to get home to you. We don't live together. To me, he lied. He was trying to distort reality.
Yeah. So this is validation seeking is a really common trend we see. In fact, very often sex addicts, it's more about, to put it crudely, the hunt, if you will, and getting somebody kind of on the hook, to mix my metaphors, versus the outcome, right? It's about the validation. And sometimes often if you get somebody interested, then you kind of lose interest in them. So it's really about this need. It's this big, and I know most addicts probably have a big kind of empty hole that needs to be filled. And there's never enough validation in the world, by the way, to really fill that. And so I think that's a real issue. Any sex addict who's looking for validation from women is a real red flag for me. And I think, that's common in the beginning because it's such a common issue, but I think it's really something that needs to be addressed. And therapeutically, I think we need to move from those sources of external validation to some more providing inside, like knowing that I am okay with myself. I don't need anything that you're going to do or say to me to make me feel okay. And by the way, even though you may say that, if I don't believe it myself, it kind of falls flat anyway. I don't really believe it. But it feels good at the moment. It's like a sugar high. But I think we need to learn how to generate that validation internally. And that's a struggle sometimes because most sex addicts, when those core beliefs, it's like I'm unworthy of love. Just our self-esteem, our self-worth is often very much under valued, despite the fact that we may be full of ego and narcissists. There's still this internal doubt that we kind of deserve to exist at some point. So I think that's a real issue that needs to be addressed with him and his work. And I don't know what to make of the fact that he's telling, can't wait to get home. He doesn't live with you. That's just kind of, to me, that's posturing and creating a front. And that's by the way, another kind of dangerous, I think, kind of warning sign to me, because what do addicts do? We create this false persona. My front-facing, public face is usually, it's like kind of, I think, a Facebook or social media profile is very carefully constructed and curated, and just everything looks just right, and it's all perfect, and aren't we wonderful? But I think the reality is somewhere it doesn't quite match that. And I think, so if I see somebody painting that picture, a false picture, that's a warning sign. Because our company is called Seeking Integrity, right? What is integrity? It's about kind of being consistent, buying kind of the inside matches the outside. What you see is what you get, kind of thing. Being true, being all the parts of ourselves being integrated into one whole. And your comments kind of don't reflect that, and that's a concern.
Yeah, I mean, that question struck me as your gut is telling you something's wonky here. And I think your gut is right. I mean, I just was like, ooh, there's a red flag. There's a red, there's just a lot of red flags in that one.
Yeah.
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 So, I mean, I feel your pain in that question. Like, why would he do this? Um, yeah. Yeah. This next one is it's from a betrayed partner whose addict became a sex addict as a senior citizen, beginning with his first smartphone. He repeatedly cheated both online and in person for years, claiming that he loved me and claiming that he stopped his behavior multiple times, but he did not. She wants, I'm assuming this is a woman, can I ever trust someone after this?
Um, yeah. So, we see, I think we have a lot of stereotypes about sex anyway, and that and there's a lot of ageism too. So understanding that if you're older, you're not sexual and you can't be a sex addict, which is of course not the case. It can happen at any age, just as it can happen with chemsex. I've had meth addicts in their 70s who just picked up the drug. So it can happen anytime. Um, you know, Sometimes addicts can have a long history of betrayal, betraying actions online, and I've seen miracles. I mean, I remain the optimist with people who, even with long histories, or people who picked it up late in life, who can really make significant change. It depends on the motivation and the willingness of that person to make the change. And what making the change means really is the willingness to kind of put down the behavior first, but then to take a serious look at themselves and look at, okay, what's going on here, kind of under the surface, kind of do a deep dive on some of the issues of, we've talked about some of those core beliefs that happen with early childhood trauma, and there's all kinds of things like that that kind of play out and fuel the addiction. So I think despite the repeated betrayals, if you will, and long online history, I think anybody has the potential for getting better. So this kind of would be to go back to what we started out with tonight about uncertainty, right? This is a question that really kind of screams uncertainty. And I would encourage you not to jump to conclusions and just take it a day at a time, stay connected to your gut and see and know that this kind of has the trajectory is a longer one with sex addiction and with the partners, by the way, who can take a long time to regain trust if they're going to regain trust. So what's the time frame? It's always discouraging. I don't always say it, but it's like 5 years, right, Scott? That they say, I think, to typically get back to really good connection and intimacy. What I found,
At least a year. I mean, yeah.
yeah, I mean, well, things happen quickly, but it's to really heal. But it takes time and willingness on both parts.
Yeah, and but David and I have both seen relationships that if we had been honest at the beginning, we would have said, "Oh, no way is this going to make it." But not only have they made it, they've become like much stronger than ever. I mean, because the addict becomes much more honest and transparent and open and more vulnerable, and accountable, and because of that, because of the addict maybe being vulnerable for the first time ever in the relationship, um, intimacy builds in a way that it never built before, and the connection can actually be so much better down the line, if everybody's willing to stick with it. But it does take some time. Again, David, one of the things David talked about was patience, with uncertainty, and this is uncertainty, and patience plays in. But I know that's hard when your feelings, when the amygdala is kicking in, it's really hard to be patient. But yeah, you can trust him. At some point, he's going to have to earn it.
Right. It's based on behavior, not words, obviously. And I would say, that very often, when I was doing the subtitle of my book, which is more about gay men and chemsex, it was the subtitle started out by reclaiming, healthy sex and intimacy or something like that. But the word reclaiming was there. I realized probably it's not a matter of reclaiming at all, but really learning for the first time how to do it. I think people that are untreated addicts probably don't know how to do intimacy very well or how to connect, like Scott was just saying, or be vulnerable. So I think in many ways, the skills that go with recovery can actually make a relationship much better and much stronger because people are, ideally, both parties are showing up with their emotions, with their hearts, and with their feelings. They're connected. So I think there's again, I think to be kind of optimistic, I think there's great potential in recovery for healing. It's just unbelievable, unlimited.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, addicts, the reason we become addicts is we learn usually early in life that other people are not going to meet our needs. They can't be trusted to meet our needs, or they will inconsistently meet our needs. Or so basically the trauma that we talked about earlier, all the different kinds of trauma, some of which are very overt, some of which are kind of hidden. Neglect is hidden. Spiritual abuse, it can be hidden, because just nobody ever talks to you about it. There's a form of sexual abuse, it's called sexual neglect, where you're just never given any education and you have no role models, so you don't know what sex is. So it's all very confusing and frightening. And if you bring it up, you get shot down. And so addicts, we're afraid to be vulnerable with other people, which is usually the way to get our needs met. So rather than being vulnerable, where we might get hurt, or feel rejected or whatever, we turn to something we can trust, like a substance, or an addictive behavior like pornography, because even though that doesn't meet whatever our need is, the underlying need at that time, to be loved and understood and known, it distracts us from that need, so we don't have to feel the pain. So for us to, it's a process, as David said. I mean, I had no idea how to be intimate with anybody when I entered recovery, nor did I want to. It scared the hell out of me. And I just couldn't understand what was so great about it, because I'd never seen it. And it was a very slow process for me to open up. And sadly, betrayed partners are often the last one invited to the party. Like, I'll be open with my therapist first, because I'm paying my therapist. He's not going to reject me. He's going to sit there and nod and say, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and not run screaming from the room. And then I'll go to a 12-step meeting, and maybe I'll trust a sponsor and a couple of guys in the room who have similar problems, and start talking to them and opening. And then eventually I might start opening up with my spouse. And that stinks for the spouse to be the last one in line, but it's also a compliment, because you're the relationship that matters the most.
Right.
And you're the relationship that can hurt the most if he reaches out to you and you don't meet his needs. And I'm not saying you have to perfectly meet somebody's needs. You don't. As a matter of fact, if you perfectly meet somebody's needs, they can't grow. There's the too perfect parent, I think, is the psychological term. Maybe David will correct me on that. But so I got way off again. I'm just rambling tonight, but there's hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're out of time. We've got a couple questions left, so save these, bring them to us next week. We'll be back same time, same place, next week. And anything you want to say to take us out, David?
Just remember that uncertainty opens up that whole gateway into fear, and there's other tools. We don't have to go down that road. We can take care of ourselves in the moment.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, David, for being here.
Safe
We'll see
travel.
you soon. Good night, everybody.
Good night.